What's up, everybody? I'm Jason and welcome back to the vlog. So I haven't done one of these in a while, and so I'm probably going to be a little bit out of practice, but if you haven't seen this and you're used to my usual kind of content, which is super technical R5 Canon camera stuff, this is where I kind of talk about stuff that I find interesting in the world of photography and camera gear. Usually I have a slight twist to this and talking that there's a little bit more focus on sort of engineering and user interface stuff. Sometimes I'm talking about stuff I have experience with. Sometimes I'm talking about stuff I don't have experience with. In this case, or direct experience, I should say, as in like I own the product or I've used the product. But in this case, I am talking about basically this is my reaction to Canon's new product announcements for November of 2022. So they just announced the R6 Mark II, the Speedlite EL-5, and a RF 135mm f1.8L IS USM lens. I obviously, you can look at the subscriber count. I am not a Canon ambassador. I do not get pre-release hardware from Canon. I don't get any hardware from Canon. In fact, like the vast majority of us out there on the market. So anything that I buy is something that I buy with my own money, essentially. Which means when I'm talking about these products, I'm talking about these products from the perspective of somebody who, one, doesn't get free stuff from Canon to play with and tell you how good it is because I work, or I have a relationship with Canon because I don't. And two, I'm talking about it from the perspective of somebody who might actually consider buying some of these products that I'm actually looking at in that perspective. So let's dive in and talk about the gear. So we're going to start with talking about the R6 Mark II, which is really interesting to me in a sense because Canon has... The only time I can ever remember Canon re-releasing products or releasing updated products on a 2-year timetable, and that's really what we're talking about with the R6 Mark II. It's a 2022 camera. The original one was launched in 2020. Is basically their Rebels. The Rebel DSLRs were launched on there was a yearly update cycle for those. So this is a real, like, I mean, clearly, okay, there was obviously some stuff going on with the pandemic and all of that in the last couple of years. There's also clearly some stuff with Canon being, we could call it, slow to getting into mirrorless, at least at a serious level, so they're moving maybe quicker to catch up. But this was a really interesting sort of release for me in looking at it because of how quickly Canon iterated on it. And then the second part of this whole thing is how Canon has placed this in their product line sort of feature and capability wise. So I'm really reminded back of the situation Nikon put themselves in the late 2000s when they released the D3 and the D700. And if you weren't around then or you're not at all familiar with Nikon cameras back then, the situation was basically Nikon took all of the D3's capabilities, put them in the D700, little lower frame rate, not quite the same frame rate, didn't have a integrated battery grip, wasn't as weather sealed, but it was the same AF system, it was the same sensor, it was broadly the same capabilities, and then sold it for mid-tier DSLR price. So the D3 was like $6,000 or $5,500 or something like that, and the D700 was $3,500 or something in that range. And basically, it was great for us as consumers, as photographers, because you could go buy, if you were a Nikon shooter, you could go buy a D700 for, a completely reasonable price, and you could get a top-notch professional quality camera. If you were Nikon on the business side of things, what they ended up doing, as far as I can tell, is they completely cannibalized and destroyed their D3 sales. Yes, they sold some D3s. There were some professional photographers who would who would spend the money to get the D3 for the weather sealing and whatnot. But for example, all of the professional and semi-professional photojournalists that I knew at the time, and that those people knew through, you know, working with other photojournalists, basically nobody bought D3s that I knew, at least. Pretty much everybody bought D700s, and they would buy two D700s instead of one D3 and pocket a D3's worth of camera savings, so they would have two cameras. So the semi-professional guys did the normal kind of upgrade dance that, you know, most amateurs and semi-professional photographers do, where you take or you buy the current model, your old camera, which was your old primary camera, becomes your backup camera, so it's one model back, and then you sell off your old backup camera, which is now 2 generations out of date. But like what I knew with a lot of those guys is they'd buy two D700s, they'd sell their old cameras, and they'd have 2 full-frame, really high-quality cameras, because the D700 really was that compared to the D3. And why am I talking about this? Well, because the same situation is the situation I see with the R3 and the R6 Mark II. In fact, it's even slightly more lopsided depending on what your exact situation is. So if you're a still photographer and you don't absolutely need weather sealing, the R3 Mark II looks really compelling. So 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter compared to the 30 frames per second that the R3 shoots. Yeah, please, hello. That's a, if I'm a still sports action photographer, hello, yes. The same ISO range, broadly the same. We should expect image quality because the sensors are virtually identical. Early noise tests published by the Digital Picture showed basically really good noise performance on the sensor, probably pretty much on par with the R3. Where it lacks, well, a smaller, lighter body, so, you know, not everybody is completely interested in carrying around a big honkin' heavy DSLR-sized mirrorless body. Granted, some people like me put battery grips on all of their cameras, but, you know, if I can get the performance without, you know, or I should say, I know people who, if they can get the performance without the battery grip and the extra weight, they're all over that. So, smaller, lighter body than the R3 while still delivering the frame rate, resolution, etc. I mean, that's pretty compelling. It does support a battery grip, so Canon didn't cripple the camera by saying, well, we're not going to make it so that you can put a battery grip on it, kind of like Nikon did with the first generation of their Z6 and Z7 mirrorless cameras. You know, because there would be a like differentiating point between, say, the R6 Mark II and the R3 is if you couldn't put a battery grip on the R6 Mark II, you wouldn't get the vertical ergonomics, the improved weight and balance with large lenses, the bigger gripping surface that battery grips generally add, and the extra battery life that the battery grips generally add. And actually, as a real big selling point, the battery grip supported on the R6 Mark II is the same battery grip that's used on the R5, the R6, and the R5C. So it's the BGR10. It's the, like, which I'll talk about this a little bit later, but that's a real positive to me. I really would like to see Canon develop or continue with that thought process that battery grips should not need to be replaced with every generation of camera, so long as the batteries aren't actually changing. Now, of course, where the R3 wins is that it has some video capabilities that the R6 Mark II doesn't have. It has a higher res EVF, but the EVFs on the 2 cameras are the same magnification, and you know, maybe that's not super important given everything else, and 3+ megapixel is still, or 3+ million, 3.5 million dots is still a pretty reasonable EVF. The R6 Mark II is, of course, not weather sealed like the R3 is, so it's not going to be rugged in those situations. But like the huge point that compounds all of this is the R6 Mark II is less than 50% of the price of the R3. So the R3's Canon's asking $6,500. I've said it before. I think that's way higher than the camera is, or that's that's overpriced. I don't think the camera is worth $6,500, at least not, especially not in comparison to the Z9 and the A1. But that's what Canon's asking for it. Okay, fine. They're going to charge what they can think the market will, or what they feel that the market or the value of the camera is. But now we have the R6 Mark II. It's $2,500 with all of these capabilities comparable to the R3. And I think, you know, I mean, it's a really compelling camera, at least on paper, and at least from the early image quality tests that I've seen in that respect. So, some things to talk about the camera. Resolution is the first one, because I've watched a couple of reviews or previews from various people, Peter McKinnon included, that have kind of whined about the fact that it's 24.2 megapixels, or let's just call it 24 megapixel resolution, and they wanted something higher. Well, for starters, this is where one of those things is that gets complicated, and I may have to spend a little time talking about this. So, first off, the thing is, we've been seeing this for a while, but there's decidedly diminishing returns on increasing resolution in cameras. When I upgraded my R5 or my 5D Mark IVs, which are 30 megapixels, to the R5, which is 45 megapixels, that was a 50% increase in resolution. The pictures aren't 50% better. They're not even 25% better, if you ask me. They're marginally better. There's certainly aspects and places where they are better, but it's not, well, I have 50% more resolution, I get 50% better images. Part of all of this problem with resolution in cameras is simply where you go with it, what you're doing with it, and physics. So there are limits to how small the pixels really can be, or well, there's not. Let me rephrase that. There are limits to how small, or how much smaller we can usefully make pixels without having major considerations other places. So we can make pixels considerably smaller, and we could go to sub-diffraction imaging, which would eliminate the need for a optical low-pass filter. The lenses would do that, and lenses and diffraction would do that. But we'd also have to, if we were doing that, make a fundamental shift in how we process and deal with images. So software like Lightroom, Photoshop, etc. would all have to be sort of fundamentally reworked to process things in a sub-diffraction regime, not necessarily technically, but the way the interface exposes things to us as photographers. Photographers will have to radically shift their mindset about things going to, say, sub-diffraction, you know, way smaller pixels, way higher resolutions. In fact, this is generally true even now with higher resolution, the 45, 50, and 60 megapixel cameras that are flagship stuff from pretty much all the companies now, all the major manufacturers, is you can't look at a 45 or 60 megapixel image in the same way that you looked at a 12 megapixel image. Fundamentally, the pixels are not as important, and you shouldn't be looking at them like that. And fundamentally, everything comes back to the ultimate problem, which with all of this, which is our own eyes. And when you print a picture, we have a limited ability to resolve detail on the picture due to the limitations of our own eyes, which means that there's sort of an inherent natural limit to how much resolution you actually need in a sensor to sort of make an image that satisfies 90, I won't say 90%, the vast majority of conditions. Of course, somebody can always point to some edge case. There's always an edge case, and there's always a case where you could point to something and say, well, you should be shooting medium format, or you should be shooting multi-image panoramas or something because of a specific edge case. But the general photographic use of take a picture, make some adjustments, make a print, or display it on a computer screen, really, this is not a huge, this is not an infinite or an endless problem. That there is a point where you just don't need more resolution, or adding more resolution doesn't add had anywhere near as much capability or quality as just keeping the same resolution. And interestingly, I think we're starting to see this actually solidifying in the camera manufacturers. Sony's A7R 5, 6, whatever it is, the latest generation of the A7R is the same resolution as the last generation. The sensors didn't get upgraded to higher resolution. Nikon has been sitting at 45 megapixels with their high-end cameras since the D850 DSLR. What was that, 2016? So like 8 years. And this has been several iterations of cameras. So the D850 was 45 megapixels, the Z7 was 45 megapixels, the Z7 Mark II, which really should have been the Z7S, was 45 megapixels, and the Z9 is 45 megapixels. And Canon just has gotten to 45 megapixels on their higher resolution cameras with the R5, but they didn't jump back to 50. They did have a 50 megapixel camera in the 5DS, but, we're starting to see, it looks like camera companies may be solidifying on a couple of reasonable resolution points that there isn't a huge amount of value either for us as photographers or them as companies trying to push further. So the 24.2 megapixel resolution on the R6 Mark II, well, for starters, it's good. It's fine. It's better than film. And lots of people love to pretend that film has infinite resolving power, but it doesn't. But it's more than adequate to make high resolution or high quality prints. It's more than adequate for anything you're going to put on a computer screen. And, quite frankly, it's also completely comparable to the competition. So Sony's using 24 megapixels in the A7S series and the A9 series for that matter. Nikon's at 24 megapixels with the Z6, Z6 Mark II. Obviously, they're going to upgrade, or there will be a Z6 Mark III at some point in the future that time will tell whether that remains at 24 megapixels or goes up. And I'm not getting too caught up on the details here, because somewhere between, say, 22 and 28 megapixels, there's always a little bit of wiggle room, and everybody's always going to make some modifications, and there may ultimately be reasons for a manufacturer to, not want to do 24 and want to do 25, or not want to do 24 and do 26, or something like that for various manufacturing reasons or whatever. But the resolution looks like it's more than adequate for pretty much anything. I mean, I would certainly be comfortable shooting at 24.2 megapixels, especially given the quality of the images the R3 produces and the quality of the images that I've seen from early tests of the R6 Mark II. Because like I said, the 45 megapixels of the R5 is, well, it's not 40 or 50% better than what I was shooting at 26 or at 30, and so it is what it is there. So let's move on. Of course, the second thing I want to talk about big on the camera is the control and UI. So Canon keeps changing things, and there's pros and cons to this. And the big changes that Canon made on the R6 Mark II is the video still photo switch and the power lock switch. Now, there are pros and cons to Canon's sort of approach to dealing with controls on cameras. So, one hand, Canon is not afraid to make changes. This was really obvious if you rewind and you go back to the transition from film to digital, and you look at what the camera, what Nikon and Canon were doing, and Canon very quickly over 5 or 6 years, which is very quickly in terms of camera iterations, realized that unlike film, digital photography, ISO is an exposure control handle, and that people wanted to or needed to be able to change ISO and effectively and easily. And they very quickly worked to move the ISO control from being buried in an inaccessible, especially inaccessible menu. That was what it was on the very early Canon DSLRs, to a less accessible button, which is what it was on the earliest Canon, like the 10D, I think it was, certainly the 60D or D60 and D30, maybe the 10D, to something that was pretty easy to get to by the time you got to the 30 and 40D. Compared to like Nikon, who very much didn't seem to want to make controls accessible. And I mean, or the ISO control, I should say, accessible. And instead, Nikon's approach, which I'm not going to say it was wrong, but their approach was to focus more on auto ISO. So Nikon definitely got better auto ISO faster than Canon did. But generally speaking, it was less focused on moving controls efficiently than it was on maintaining a physical backwards compatibility, whereas Canon is more willing to change things. Of course, in more recent times, we've seen that with the touch bar on the EOS R, which if Canon wasn't willing to experiment or make changes to the UI, then that wouldn't be a thing. Where this kind of gets frustrating and problematic is when they keep making little changes to things that probably aren't really beneficial. And so I should underscore this and say, from a physical user interface perspective, my argument or position is essentially that the physical user interface should be designed to maximize the accessibility of the most important controls and place less important controls in various other, where they're maybe not as accessible. So you certainly, like, I would make the argument that the power switch on Nikon DSLRs, and I think they still use it on their mirrorless cameras, that rings the shutter release, is not ideal. It's not bad because it doesn't really get in the way of anything else, but it doesn't really need to be there when it could be somewhere else, because you really shouldn't need to turn your camera on and off that much in general. And that kind of brings me to the meat of the problem that I have with the R5 or the R6 Mark II and some of the discussions I've seen around it. So I have seen some people saying that they like that the new power switch is much easier to get to and that they can turn their camera on and off that much easier. And to me, this feels like it's a real band-aid. Not that the users are wrong per se, but that Canon is fixing a problem, fixing the wrong problem. So the power switch, to me, on a mirror, like, power on a mirrorless camera is pretty much everything. You can't do anything without power, and because the camera uses power to do everything, it drains batteries like has never been a thing in cameras in the past. The workaround that I see a lot of photographers doing is to turn their camera off a lot. I know plenty of photographers who have really gotten in the habit after moving to mirrorless of, where with a DSLR, they just leave it on and let it go to sleep and wouldn't worry about it. But now with a mirrorless camera, they are constantly turn it on, take a couple pictures, turn it off. And that shouldn't be the way of working. It's not moving the power switch to make that process more efficient is far worse than making the camera more efficient so you can just use it like you did a DSLR and leave it on but asleep. So my first sort of complaint or whatever here is that by moving the power switch to make it easier to turn the camera on and off, it feels like Canon is trying to fix the wrong power problem. Make the system more efficient. Make the system better able to turn on and off. Make the system better able to, monitor things. Like, why not have, for example, a capacitive sensor in the hand grip? So if you're not holding the hand grip, then the camera knows, or your eye is to the viewfinder, because there's already a sensor for looking at the viewfinder. If the camera knows that you're not touching the hand grip or your eye isn't at the viewfinder, turn stuff off. Put the camera in a low power mode. It doesn't have to go full sleep, but like you could definitely turn off the display or turn off the sensor or set the timeout a lot shorter than what it would be if you were holding the hand grip or something to optimize power efficiency. Focus more on power efficiency with the sensor designs, the processor designs, etc., instead of making it something that people are flipping the switch on. And quite honestly, so my experience, at least with the R5, has been turning the camera on and off is actually the worst thing you can do for power efficiency. I don't know what it is specifically, but at least on my camera and my configuration, I will run through batteries faster if I turn the camera on and off constantly than if I just leave the camera on and let it go to sleep. So the second part of this change is the mode dial photo video switch situation. So the photo video switch is moved to where the power switch used to be, which of course is frustrating in my opinion from a muscle memory perspective, because you have muscle memory to turn the camera off where the photo video switch is, as opposed to turning the camera off where the on-off switch is. So if you are coming to the R5 Mark or R6 Mark II from the R6, you're going to have things like they moved things to where things were. This is also the first time I can think of in a mid to higher tier camera where Canon has put the power switch where they put it on the R6 Mark II. And it's the first time that Canon has put a photo video switch where they've put it there. In the past, it's always been a ring around the multi-controller on the back of the camera. That's what it is on the R3 as well. In fact, I don't know why they didn't just do that on the R6 Mark II, except for maybe cost reasons. But anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about the mode dial and the photo video switch. So I'm going to preface this with something that might be a bit controversial, and it might be a bit, I don't know, against the grain. But my position is that mode dials on cameras should go away. They're increasingly becoming an inferior solution to digital mode selection like the R5, R3, and the 1D series does. This is sort of a threefold problem. So first of all, mode dials, the way that they exist, make a lot of sense when storage in the camera is expensive. By storage, I'm talking about either DRAM or non-volatile memory to store information about what mode the camera is in. So in the past, in the 70s and 80s and whatnot, that stuff was expensive, but you could put what essentially is an absolute position rotary encoder that is as a mode dial. So on the mode dial, it tells you what mode it is, and then that is the memory that saves what mode the camera is in. So that made sense in the past from a purely like engineering perspective. It didn't hurt in the past that the mode dials had maybe 4 or 5 modes on them. I mean, it used to be that the only thing you had on your camera, or like even going back to a 5D Mark IV, the modes were full auto, program, shutter priority, aperture priority, manual, bulb, and 3 custom modes for a total of 9 settings on the mode dial. Well, Canon keeps adding to that. So on the R6 Mark II, the dial now has 13 positions, and I'm not even going to go through them, but it's all of the normal stuff, plus a creative filters mode, a video standby thing mode. I mean, it's just, there's tons of stuff. Of course, Canon now has flexible priority, which is all kinds of complicated. If you don't use these things, they get in the way. It's finer, you have to have finer control or finer motor motions to make adjustments, even though the mode dials have detents, but you have to make finer adjustments because there are now more positions on the dial that you have to adjust through. The text has to be smaller, or the dial has to be bigger, which makes it harder to read or takes up more area. If you compare that, and of course you can't get rid of things. So I don't use auto and flexible priority at all. On my R5, I have them disabled. I can't select them. It's two things that are just completely just straight up gone from my mode selection, and I don't have to worry about accidentally putting the camera in flexible priority or full auto because they're not a selectable option. Well, you can't do that with a physical mode dial. It also takes up space on the top of the camera. So where there could be an LCD display on the top of the R6, we have a mode dial instead. Now, top LCDs, I'm going to make the argument that they're increasingly less useful. I certainly don't find the top LCD on my R5 to be all that useful, in no small part because the white on black text that Canon has chosen to use makes it much harder to read than black on white was in the past, at least for me, and at least in most lighting conditions. In some cases, it's fine. But the reality is that LCD doesn't cost a lot of money. And not having to have a mode dial, like I said, I don't think they're useful anymore. A physical, analog, whatever you want to call it, mode dial compared to the digital selection that Canon does on the R5, the R3, and the 1DX series. Where things, I think, continue to compound on this whole thing is when you play into the video switch. So maybe I'm overthinking this, but I have sort of three thoughts on this, which is, first of all, it requires two hands now to switch the camera from photo to video mode. Now, granted, I'm one of the first people to say that photo and video modes, or switching from photography to videography, is more of a context switch than just switching a button on the camera. There's a lot more that you have to do to really make it make sense. But do you really have to make it a two-handed process? So on the R5, it's hit the mode button, hit the info button. I can do all of this with my hand on the one hand on the camera, essentially. On the R6 Mark II, it's going to be turn the photo still video dial on one side, and then that gets you into video mode. But then there comes the next problem, and this is where maybe I'm overstating this, but for me, at least, I almost never shoot video in the same mode that I shoot stills in. I shoot stills almost entirely in aperture priority. I shoot video almost entirely in manual or one of the custom modes, depending on what I'm doing. So I have my R5 set up so that C1 is for shooting in the studio, C2 is for shooting high frame rate, C3 is kind of an emergency catch-all thing for shooting outside if I'm in action and something really interesting happens, and otherwise I shoot in manual in video mode. So on the R5, when you change from photo to video mode, the camera also changes the exposure mode that it's set to. So I can have photo mode and aperture priority, hit mode info, switch to video mode, and the camera instantly switches to manual. And I have full manual control for shooting manual video. Of course, the reason I say this is, so from that perspective, the physical mode dial and the photo video switch pose the thing of now you also have to, you flick a switch to switch into video mode, and then you have to change the mode dial to the right mode that you want in video mode. Now, the reason I say maybe I'm overstating this is I tend to shoot my video from more of a cinematography thought process context. It's not necessarily as run and gun as some people may shoot. As a result, maybe it's more frequent for people to shoot, just it's fine, the camera's in aperture priority, I'll just flip it over. Or alternatively, people are very split on the whole thing and they're not doing stills and video kind of somewhat simultaneously, in which case, the camera will always be in video mode and whatever mode you set to, and very rarely is that change going to happen. But I think it could be more elegant or better implemented, I guess, is my position on that. Otherwise, the controls on the camera and the ergonomics user interface look pretty solid. I mean, the camera body looks to be basically the same as the R6. in terms of size, layout, grip, etc. It's got Canon's dual quick command dials, so it's got all 3 dials, which again, really that was, I think, one of the best things that Canon did with the mirrorless cameras is have direct access to shutter, aperture, and ISO, which are your primary exposure controls, so you don't have to go through menus for any of them. They're all on a dial. It's got the same button layout on the back of the camera, so aside from the muscle memory issue of the photo video switch and power switch, all the other muscle memory that you have from an R6 or even an R5 should be applicable to the R6 Mark II because everything is pretty much in the same place. And as I said, the huge one for me is that Canon is using the same BGR10 battery grip that they use on the R6 and the R5 and the R5C on the R6 Mark II. So if you already had an R6 and you upgraded and you had a battery grip, you don't have to buy a new battery grip. And I think that's a really nice feature to have just from a sort of cost-saving perspective for us as battery grip users. And quite honestly, from a cost-saving perspective, it's not a bad thing for Canon either. Instead of having to tool up and manufacture a battery grip for every model of camera, which makes the battery grips more expensive because there's going to be fewer units sold, which means that there's less to amortize the production cost, the tooling up costs, the fixed costs in production and engineering. You're selling the same grip over more cameras, so there's going to be more potential buyers, more potential users. The costs amortize better for Canon as a whole, so that the battery grips are either more profitable or can be made slightly cheaper in terms of what we're talking, end user price for the same overall profit margin for the whole product line. So I like this. I think that's a good thing. Upgrades to the AF system. Specifically, I want to talk about the new subject detections. And I want to preface this by saying, great, Canon, you added some new stuff to the R6 Mark II. When are the subjects coming to the R5 and the R3? Now, I can understand that the R6 Mark II, and the even bigger question for me as an R5C owner is I hate saying that because they really should be coming to the R5 and R3. When that happens, what about the R5C's photo mode? Are we going to get the upgrades too? Because this is the one concern that I had with the R5C is that it's not going to get the photo mode upgrades that the R5 gets because it's a cinema camera and therefore the product teams working on it don't have the same interest in continuing to develop that side of the camera as the still platform does. But I can understand Canon not bringing the new animal and vehicle detection stuff to the R6. Ultimately, when push comes to shove, the R6 is being replaced. That's why this is the R6 Mark II and not the R63 or R10 or whatever R8 or whatever you want to call it. It's the same, it's the subsequent product upgrade in that model line. So I can understand not bringing the new autofocus capabilities to the R6 Mark or the original R6. However, the R5 isn't being replaced. It's not going to be replaced in November. Nothing is being said now at all. There's nothing on the rumor mills that I've seen about a new R5 coming anytime soon, the R5 Mark II. So we should be like, this is we should see a photo update or an AF subject detection update. Same thing goes with the R3. It is Canon's current flagship mirrorless camera. It's a year old. This was a weird cycle, again, as I said, for the R6, because the R6, the first one, only lasted for 2 years before it got replaced with the Mark II. I don't expect to see the R5 get replaced for at least another year or two. I expect a 4-year life cycle out of the R5. It certainly stands up reasonably well to that. I mean, I don't see any strong compelling argument to say that the R5 needs to be upgraded now because it's not good anymore or it's not competitive anymore or whatever. And of course, the R3 was just released last year. So the R3 is like basically brand new. So my first question is why wasn't there an announcement that these upgrades, updated subject detections are coming to the R3 and R5? And they should be coming to the R3 and R5, and there's no good excuse for them not to come to the R3 and R5 because the R6 Mark II uses the exact same processor. Unless Canon's doing some tomfoolery with processor stuff behind the curtains and they're not talking about it, the R5, R6, R6 Mark II, R3, R7, R10 all use the Digic X processor. That processor, if one camera could do something, like, again, at least with respect to subject detection, if the R6 can do something with respect, or R6 II can do something with respect to subject detection, the R5 and R3 certainly should be able to do it as well. So, situation, subject detection, R6 Mark II. Some changes. First is an auto mode. So, I get it. Nikon introduced the whole thing with the Z9. It's supposed to detect everything and then select something using some kind of AI process or whatever. Not a real selling point to me. I like to be able to tell the camera what thing I want it to focus on or prioritize on, but again, R6s are aimed at a little more consumer level than I tend to think or work, so I could see where auto makes sense in that case, that people could leave it on auto and it will select people, it'll select cats and dogs, it'll select cars, whatever. The next one is people. Pretty standard. It's the same thing in all the other cameras that do it. Eye, head, face, body, blah, blah, blah. You know, there were no announced changes to people. Animals. So animals has traditionally been domestic dogs, domestic cats, birds, and horses, and birds. Now, R6 Mark II adds horses. Okay. Here's my question. And this isn't even like a, gee, why would they add horses? Well, that's stupid. I mean, because, well, look, there's plenty of situations in, say, sports, so horse racing, where people would want potentially to have the camera auto track a horse. I could see a thought process there. It makes sense. Here's the question I'm asking. How well does horse detection work for horse-shaped non-horse animals? But what I mean by that is deer, elk, moose, gazelle, pronghorn, mountain goats. All of these things look more like horses than they look like dogs or cats. When I was in Yellowstone last summer, I did a lot of subject detection with my R5 on animal mode, and it was pretty good at like detecting bison, elk, bears, stuff like that, and tracking that. Where it fell down was it could clearly detect that there was an animal there of some sort, but it couldn't do head detection. So if I was tight on a elk, it couldn't figure out that where the head of the elk was. I had to go to a single point for that. It couldn't do eye detection. It would, if I had eye detection enables, a lot of times it would detect the back end of the animal as the eye instead of, or the tail as the eye instead of the eye on the head. This would all obviously be improved given the fact that all of the subject detection stuff is really pretty fuzzy anyway. I mean, for example, I've shot air shows with subject detection and tracking. I set the camera to animal modes and it thinks all the planes are birds. Well, they kind of look the same to a certain extent, and it would track and detect them just fine, you know, so, I mean, it worked. Not ideal. Couldn't, like, locate the cockpit or anything like that, but it worked to at least a good enough extent that you could actually track and photograph a plane. Animals worked, in my experience, for a very limited definition of worked when it came to talking about non-cat, dog, bird type things. So what I'm interested in is, and this is something, well, part of the reason, a big reason why I really want to see this come to the R5, because that's what I shoot wildlife with, is how this handles horse-like non-horses. Because in theory, if the camera can detect a horse,
an elk looks an awful lot like a funny shaped horse, but it looks a lot more like a horse than it does a dog. In theory, it should be able to work on elk and find elk heads and so forth. The last update to the autofocus detection is to vehicles. So previously it was race cars or motorsports cars and motorcycles. They've now added aircraft and trains. I understand aircraft make a lot of sense. For me, in my thought process, a lot of the stuff in subject detection tends to make sense coming from it from one of two angles. So either you come from it from the professional context, and it becomes about offloading cognitive load. So say people, for example, in a sports situation where you have tennis players or somebody actively moving around a lot, if I don't have to think about where the focus point is and the camera can actually detect the person and put the focus point in the right place, I can worry about paying attention to the action and paying attention to the composition more. From a consumer perspective, I can understand it in the, like, and people get the thing in focus and they don't have to understand how anything works or how to use a camera, which is a position I strongly disagree with. I think if you're going to get into photography, you should at least learn how to use the camera that you're using and not hope the camera manufacturers will make a camera that is capable of doing whatever it is you want for you. I don't think it's a good idea to give up that much control. So I get the aircraft. You have things like the Red Bull air races, the Reno air races. There's kinds of competitions with planes and air races where it's fast-paced action, long lens, things are moving quickly, and you don't necessarily want to have to think as much about, you want more cognitive ability to think about composition and what's happening and not have to worry about subject, AF points. My big thing is trains. Okay, Nikon introduced this on the Z9, and everybody that I know that was a Nikon shooter rolled their eyes and went, why? What is the big, are there really that many novice level rail fans that just don't understand that trains work or run on tracks? Like, trains are, and I'm saying this from experience, trains are one of the easiest things to figure out where they're going to be. They're on the track. You don't need to, like, rapidly get the camera to figure out that there's a train there to focus on it. It doesn't just suddenly jump out of a bush in front of you. Like, it runs on tracks. It literally can't go anywhere else. You can literally pre-focus where the train's going to be, where you want the train in your picture before the train gets there, because when the train gets there, it's not going to be 60 feet over there. It's going to be on the track. Now, of course, the thing is I understand why Canon's adding trains, because Nikon added trains, and eventually Sony will have to add trains, because we're in the dog and pony show about autofocus subject detection, and everything has to, like, we can't let them get ahead of us. My whole point on the whole thing with the trains, at least, is what could the time have been, and processing power and R&D time been put into that would have been more broadly useful in the context, again, that I come to for subject detection, which is help the photographer by making it easier to deal with fast evolving situations that could change on the fly. Like, could we have bear detection? Could we have African big game detection? I mean, I guess maybe the question that I'm not asking that I should be asking is, how many people are going to use subject detection to shoot railfan photography compared to subject detection to shoot deer or elk or bears or lions or elephants? Like, I don't know. I don't get it. I still think trains would be better, that the time put into trains would have been better put into expanding animals. There's a whole lot of stuff that's not covered. Snakes, amphibians, fish. Fish would be a good one. I'm not even an underwater photographer, but like, if the camera could auto detect fish, that seems like it would be great for the ability to get the camera to focus on things and not have to be manual focus in a situation where you have restricted control and access to the camera because it's in a housing and you're underwater, so you have a whole lot more things you have to pay attention to, your air, your depth, all kinds of things. Getting the camera to be able to like, oh, that's a fish, that's the fish's eye, focus there, seems like it would be a really boon type thing for underwater photography, even though, like I said, I don't do it. But anyway, moving along. Something I noticed. This may actually not be new. This just is something I noticed when I was going through the data sheet for the camera, but it was talking about the eye detection, and it was talking about auto and manual selection. I've never actually paid enough attention to this. Maybe I should test it and see what happens on my R5. But the camera was talking, or the manual was talking, or the data sheet was talking about with auto detection, it will select the eye closest to the camera if you are like this, or it will select the eye closest to the center of the frame if both eyes are essentially the same distance from the camera. I don't know if that's what happens everywhere else. This is the first time I've seen it in a manual, so I thought it was interesting and maybe worth knowing or pointing out. Final thing I want to talk about on the R6 Mark II is video. Obviously, the camera is very much geared for consumer level video. It is not geared for professional level video, but it's kind of weird in a sense too. So there are no UHD formats on the camera that you can record in. It doesn't support recording in all eye format, and it doesn't record raw video internally. It does support recording 6K 60 full frame sensor raw externally using the HDMI cable connected to something like a Atomos Ninja 5 or Ninja 5 Plus, I think you might need, one of the two. So that is one option, which of course does make the camera very capable as a semi-serious cinematography camera, especially given that most people in that level of production probably are going to be using external monitors anyway, so I don't see that as a real impediment to the camera in general. 4K internal full frame is downsampled from the 6K sensor area, which I think is a plus. But again, like I said, only compression options are IPB and IPB Lite. Whether it uses H.264 or H.265 and the chroma subsampling is all pretty similar to the R5 and R6 as they stand. So 8-bit, 420, H.264 for standard picture styles, and 10-bit, 422, H.265 for HDR-PQ and Canon log. It is a 4K crop mode. The 4K crop mode is upsampled from 3.7K. This was something that I thought was... So when I read this originally, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who read this and have a cow about it, I thought originally that this was far worse than it actually is. Part of the problem here is that, again, the camera only shoots UHD formats. So ultra high def. So 4K is not 4,000 pixels, even though that's what everybody calls it. It's actually 3.8K. It's 3,840 pixels. And the 3.7K sensor resolution is like 3,760 or something like that. At least that's what it is on the, or 3,744 or something like that. It's 100 pixels off. It's a 2.5, I think it was, if I remember the math correctly, percent upscale factor. Anyway, it's basically upscaling by about 100 pixels or less than 100 pixels. It doesn't matter. It's going to look better. The 4K upsampled from the crop is probably going to look better than 4K line skipped from a crop on like the R5, or well, the R5 downsamples it. 4K line skipped. It's going to be pretty immaterial at that. The big one, in my opinion, and something that really sets the C300 sets the R6 II really apart in terms of video is full HD at 180 frames per second, full frame sensor area. Obviously, it's going to be line skipped to do this, but this leapfrogs the camera for high frame rate shooting, especially if you want shallow depth of field and big, you know, shallow depth of field, I guess is what I should say, big sensor output over pretty much all the cinema cameras. So the only two cinema cameras that can do 180 frames per second that I'm aware of or that I can think of offhand right now are the C70 and the C300 Mark II or Mark III. In both of those cases, they shoot in Super 16 crop mode, so it's like a 3x crop from full frame to get to that frame rate. Obviously, they're not line skipping for that. They're reading the full sensor area out, which is why they are running at a smaller area, lower resolution. This is possibly big. If you're a high frame rate shooter, so first of all, 180 frames per second is a 6x slowdown if you play back at 30 frames per second. It's a 7.5x slowdown if you play at 124 or 24 frames per second compared to the 5 and 4x that you would have at 120 frames per second. It's uncapped, other than thermal limits where you get about an hour of record time is what the thermal limit is, but there's no artificial limit on that. In fact, there's no artificial video record limits on any of these. The only limitation is thermal. This is to me, this is like a really compelling, if you need high frame rate shooting, this is a really compelling reason to look at the R6 Mark II. And, you know, people will say, oh, but it's not 4K when it shoots that. Yeah, it's not. 4K is kind of overrated. Not really, but I think it is at least a little overrated. Well-shot 1080p video is going to, you know, in a lot of situations look just as good as 4K, especially on TVs, especially at most viewing distances where people can't see higher than 1080p resolution visually anyway, and the 4K is just lost. So that's a thing. That's again, almost a compelling reason to really look at the camera if you're a video shooter, even though the rest of the video, I'm not going to say is underwhelming, but it's certainly not as high-end as something like what you have on the R5 or the R3. But again, full HD, 180 frames per second, that's pretty good. Thermal recording limits according to camera, so 4K 60 full frame, that's 6K downsampled is 40 plus minutes. 4K 60 crop, so that's the 3.7K upsampled is 50 plus minutes. So we can see that reading out less data actually does seem to make a difference in terms of record quality, which of course we knew looking at power numbers from the R5 and R5C and other competing cameras. 4K 30 at full frame, so again this is 6K sensor downsampled. It has no thermal limit, so for most people who are shooting sort of more cinematic content, 24 or 30 frames a second, you're not going to have a record limit problem. And full HD at 180 frames per second, Canon is saying 60 plus minutes. So again, slow-mo stuff, like you get a lot of time to work with it. And again, you see that line skipping thing, power savings, drops the heat, makes things go longer. So some overall thoughts on this. There are no DCI formats. I don't know if that's a big deal. I don't use them on my R5 or my R5C. I know some people will. You will get, if you are shooting with the intention to letterbox or however you want to put it, widen aspect ratio of your video, you will get better quality shooting a DCI format than you will shooting a UHD format and then putting letterboxes in. So like on my R5 or R5C, if I wanted to letterbox this video to make it more wide, more cinematic, I guess you could say, if I shoot it a DCI format, it'll get downsampled when I make it UHD, or I would be just uploading it as a DCI aspect ratio, and then it would be downsampled when you watch it. If you're doing UHD, you have to crop the top and the bottom off, so you're losing some resolution, potentially. The camera, the R6 II targets the same bit rates as the R5 for HEVC, so when the camera is shooting in Canon Log 3 or HDR-PQ mode, they look at the image quality should be, or the compression quality should be about the same as the R5 and R6 for that. However, it does seem to target lower bit rates for the 8-bit 420 AVC, so if you're not using HDR-PQ or C-Log, you're just shooting regular video, bit rates look to be less than half. So for example, 4K UHD, 60 frames a second, the R6 II targets 120 in IPB and 160 megabits in IPB light. The R5 targets 340 megabits in IPB and 160 megabits in IPB light. How much this is going to matter if you're, say, targeting YouTube? Very little. If you're targeting a higher end production, that could be more of a deal. And of course, there is no all-eye format, so if you're targeting a higher end production, you don't have an all-eye option to throw it to either. So I'm going to very quickly round out the other two, this video talking with the other two announcements from Canon. At least I'm going to try to get through them as quickly as I can. First one that went with the R6 Mark II is the Speedlite EL-5. The Speedlite EL-5 looks actually kind of interesting with one huge, as far as I'm concerned, fault/problem. So what it actually looks like is a reasonably priced alternative to the insanely priced EL-1. Canon wants $1,000 plus for the EL-1. They want $400 for the EL-5. Still expensive as a flash. Still going to be a lot of people that look at third-party options, but the EL-5 at least matches the EL-1 in a lot of capabilities. So it has 10 ranges of control, from 1:1 to 1 to 1/24. Most Canon flashes in the past only had 7 stops of range. This has got 10. It's got a 24 to 200 millimeter zoom with 14 millimeter diffuser panel, so this is the exact same zoom range as the EL-1 and Canon's predecessor high-end flashes, the Speedlite EX600EX RTs. LED modeling lamp. Similar to the EL-1, presumably this will also work as your autofocus illuminator. There is no autofocus illuminator, the red or infrared as Canon calls it. Autofocus illuminator on the front of the flash that isn't there anymore because none of the mirrorless cameras will use that for whatever reason. So it's gone, and instead there is a dual LED modeling light there. It is the same power output, so same guide number as the EL-1 and 600EX RT/RT2 at 200 millimeters, so it's a 60 meter guide number at ISO 100 at 200 millimeter zoom. Uses the same lithium ion battery as the EL-1, the LPEL. Uses the LPE6 charger, so great, you get a charger with your camera if you only need one charger because it'll actually charge on the LPE6 chargers. The two places that I'm not going to call it a fault. The place where okay, whatever. Canon has simplified, from looking at the pictures, the controls on the flash, the menuing on the flash, the LCD on the flash. It is definitely not as premium or complicated as the controls on the flash in, for example, the EL-1. Compensate for that, you can control the flash through your camera, where you have the full range of controls in the normal camera menu. You can also control this flash from Canon's Camera Connect app on your smartphone or tablet. Okay, I guess, I don't know. Here's the big failing, the big drawback. It uses the multi-function shoe instead of the ETTL hot shoe contacts. So when you look at the bottom of the flash, it connects to the multi-function shoe contacts. It does not connect to the ETTL contacts, which means this will only work in the R6, R3, and R5C, and I'm betting the R5C and R3 will need a firmware update before it works with those. I don't know for sure, but I'm just guessing because they were developed before this flash was released. Presumably Canon knew about it, but knowing how Canon does things, I would not be surprised to find that those two cameras didn't have multifunction shoe flash capabilities in them. But what this also means is that if you buy this $400 flash, you can't use it on any of your older cameras like your original R6 or your R5 or anything else. So For a lot of us, it's going to be a non-starter simply because you can't use it on your R6 and the R7. The R7 has a multifunction shoe on it. I keep forgetting about that. But you won't be able to use it on, like I said, your EOS R, your R5, your original R6. So as compelling as it might look as a thing, it's not going to work for a lot of us right now. Unfortunately, I have a feeling that this is going to be the direction Canon takes things going forward. I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing. It's certainly a bad thing on the premise that the flash isn't backwards compatible with older cameras. That said, I don't see the TTL contacts going away from the hot shoes anytime in the near future. So third-party flashes will still be able to be fired using ETTL in the contacts in the thing. Canon still has, they still sell their macro ring light, their macro twin light. Those have not been updated. There's still older flashes that are only the ETTL control. They're not using the multifunction shoe. It's going to take a long time for this to roll over into a new thing. Now, that said, I'm not sure if this is a good thing or a bad thing. Potentially, it could be a good thing simply from the premise that maybe it allows Canon to do something with flashes and mirrorless cameras that we hadn't been able to previously do. The flip side is, what does it do to the third-party market? Obviously, if Canon continues to make an adapter, or like you said, I don't expect to see the TTL contacts going away anytime soon, but in 10 years or 15 years, of course, by that time, maybe third parties have reverse engineered the multifunction shoe connector, or Canon's licensed it, or, it's hard to tell. And this is one of those things where the change looks like there's certainly a reason to be potentially concerned about the change, given that it's a change in a direction that's more proprietary and less standard. So we'll see. Time will tell how that goes. Final thing I want to talk about really quick, RF 135 f1.8L IS USM. It is a big, honkin', very fast lens. I'm actually really impressed with this for a couple of reasons. So first of all, it's a faster and has image stabilization compared to its EF predecessor. So Canon has delivered on the better and more, or at least the more. So it's the EF lens was an f2 and didn't have image stabilization. This has image stabilization. In fact, with cameras with in-body IS, so with coordinated IS, Canon has tested it to 8 stops according to the CIPA standards. What that actually means in practical tests is beyond me. They made a couple of design changes. Well, there's two, I don't say design changes. Why did I say that? There's some physical things that are worth noting on the lens. So it does have a control dial and a focus ring and the standard full frame RF lens. So the auto switches, so the autofocus, manual focus, and the IS on and off switches. Canon Canon has got clearly the control ring in the right place. It's on the front of the lens, so moving from the front of the lens back, it's control ring, focus ring, switches, obviously prime rim lens, so there's no zoom rings. They've added 2 buttons that are programmable on the lens. Okay. The buttons are on the left side of the lens and the top of the lens barrel. So on the left side, it would be under your thumb when you're shooting landscape, and the top one would be under your thumb when you're shooting portrait. If you're a grip down portrait shooter instead of a grip up portrait shooter, then you would need to use your middle finger or whatever to push the button on it would be the top button on the lens when the camera is rotated grip down. Nano USM motor, so my experience with those on Canon's other lenses has been that they're really quiet, really fast, and really smooth when shooting video, so I expect that out of this lens. It looks pretty solid. Things that I'm really impressed about, I guess I should say, even though the 135 is an RF 135 is not really my cup of tea, I'm not really a 135 millimeter shooter, price looks pretty good. So let me talk really quick price availability. The R6 Mark II, is expected. These are numbers from Canon USA. That's my local Canon supplier. They will vary other places, but Canon USA, they're expecting the R6 Mark II $24.99, so $2,500, available in late November of 22. They're doing pre-orders pretty much everywhere now already. The RF135 f1.8L IS USM is $2,099, so call it $2,100. It is available in January of 2023. So I'm actually really impressed by the price on this. I expected it to be more. The 8512 is like $300 or $200 more expensive, so it's actually the same price as the 50 f1.2. It's the same price as Sony's 135 f1.8. Sony's doesn't have IS. This one does. Sony's is, I think, 15 or 20 grams heavier, so this one is slightly lighter than Sony's as well. Image quality, obviously, we'll see what that ends up being, but it's an L lens. It's a 135 millimeter focal length. I expect it to be, pretty good, pretty darn good for an L lens. And the final one is the Speedlite EL-5, $399.99, $400 we'll call it, available March of 2023. So the camera in a couple of weeks should be available. The lens and the flash, first quarter of next year is when those should be out there. All told, not the biggest announcement, not necessarily the most amazing announcement, although the R6 Mark II looks pretty impressive. I don't have a lot to complain about with any of this stuff. The there's some complaints everywhere. The Speedlite especially, because the lack of the ability to use it on older cameras. But everything looks pretty solid. I mean, obviously time will tell when it gets out there in people's hands. People are shooting with it. But Canon tends to deliver on RF lenses historically, or on L lenses. Historically, their lens design software has been very good at the mid and long, or at the telephoto end of things. Their weakness has always been their wides. So being that the 135 is a telephoto, I expect it to be pretty darn solid, image quality wise, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to wrap that up here. I have rambled on for almost an hour and a quarter. If you made it this far, thanks very much for watching. If you thought this was interesting, or at least a little bit informative, or maybe you learned something, or maybe you didn't, or whatever, let me know by hitting that thumbs up button, that like button, if this did something for you or not. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.